The sound of clinking champagne glasses and the chatter of guests filled the grand ballroom of a hotel in Dallas, Texas. A string quartet played a bright waltz, but all I could hear was my father's booming laugh as he raised his glass high above the crowd. My father, Richard Lawson, had always been larger than life, a man who owned a chain of flashy car dealerships across Texas, who measured his worth not in kindness or humility, but in how many people were watching him. And today, at my brother's wedding, he had a captive audience. He stood at the center of the room, commanding attention like a politician on the campaign trail. His grin was wide, his cheeks flushed with pride as he toasted to my brother's future. My brother, Ethan, was the golden child, the family's shining star. He had just married the woman of his dreams, and my father couldn't have been prouder. I lingered at the edge of the room, deliberately away from the spotlight, sipping ginger ale instead of champagne. In that glittering sea of sequins and tuxedos, I was a ghost. And of course, my father said, sweeping his arm dramatically, let's not forget my daughter, Caroline. Always the mysterious one. A ripple of polite laughter traveled through the crowd. I felt every eye shift toward me. I kept my expression still, my posture steady, my face unreadable. Dad's grin widened as he leaned into the punchline. She works for the government down in Florida, doing something top secret, I guess. Who knows what she actually does? Maybe she's just cleaning the floors for the Navy SEALs. The room burst into laughter. Guests chuckled, clinking glasses, whispering to each other. It was a performance he'd given before, the joke about his quiet, awkward daughter with her strange, unimportant job. And, as always, people laughed. I smiled faintly, pretending not to care, but inside my blood turned to ice. From across the room, I caught the eyes of Colonel James Miller, an old family friend who had served in the army before retiring in San Antonio. His look of pity was worse than the laughter. That quiet, sympathetic gaze cut deeper than my father's careless words. It told me what everyone in the room believed, that I was the odd one out, the forgotten Lawson child. I had heard this before. It was the same dismissal I'd grown up with, when Dad said money was too tight to buy me new textbooks for college, but a week later he handed Ethan the down payment for his first Corvette. It was the same mockery at every Thanksgiving dinner, where my achievements were brushed aside like dust on the table while Ethan's every step was celebrated as a triumph. I clenched my fists inside the folds of my dress. Not a twitch of emotion crossed my face. Years in uniform had taught me control. Years of my father's ridicule had forged something colder than anger inside me, patience. They didn't know the truth. To them, I was the quiet one, the strange daughter with a government job no one understood. But the reality? The reality was written in code, in silence, in encrypted messages that saved lives before the first shot was fired. They thought I cleaned floors. What I really did was clean signals, sifting through oceans of noise to find whispers of threats that could endanger the nation. And tonight, in this glittering ballroom, while my father basked in the glow of his own arrogance, I knew a collision was coming. My two worlds, the one where I was invisible and the one where I was essential, were about to crash together. And when that happened, my father's laughter would die in his throat. The ballroom laughter at Ethan's wedding wasn't new. It was just louder, more public. The first time I realized how deep my invisibility ran was at a Thanksgiving dinner years earlier. The Lawson family house in Houston smelled of turkey, gravy, and my father's unshakable pride. He strutted around the living room like a victorious general, carrying a laminated copy of a newspaper clipping. The article was about Ethan's promotion to regional manager at the dealership. Dad waved it in everyone's faces like it was a medal of honor. To Ethan, he shouted for the third time that night, raising his bourbon. The future of this family. Making us proud every day. The room roared with approval. Aunts and uncles clapped. Cousins cheered. Ethan soaked it all in, his smile wide, his arm around his fiancée. I sat quietly at the corner of the couch, waiting for the noise to die down. Finally, during a lull, I spoke up. "I have some news, too," I said. My voice was calm, almost hesitant. Every head turned, but their expressions told me everything: mild impatience, faint curiosity, not real interest. I passed my final review. I continued. A counterintelligence polygraph. I officially have level 5 clearance now. For a second, silence. Then my mother, Linda, gave me a polite, strained smile. "Oh, that's nice, dear. Is that for some sort of promotion?" My father barked a laugh, waving his hand as if batting away a fly. All that spooky secret agent stuff. Who even knows what that means? Now Ethan, he's out there making a name for himself. Building something real. He clapped my brother on the back, returning the spotlight where he believed it belonged. The room followed his lead, nodding, smiling, forgetting me again. That was the night the nicknames started. Spooky. At first it was just Ethan, teasing me at dinner, calling me the ghost. But soon my father picked it up, then my cousins, then everyone else. It wasn't playful. It wasn't affectionate. It was a way to put me in a box. A way to tell the story they preferred, that my life was a strange little footnote to the grand tale of Ethan Lawson. They didn't know that at that very moment, half the United States Navy was running operations based on intel streams my team had secured. They didn't know that every clearance I earned meant lives saved, disasters prevented, chaos averted. I never corrected them. I never defended myself. I simply swallowed it, letting the silence sit heavy in the room. What they mistook for weakness was actually discipline. Because I had another name. Not a spooky. Not the ghost. In the cold, humming rooms where I truly lived, I was Echo. I remember one night in particular. No windows, no clocks, just rows of monitors glowing in shades of blue and green. Data streams flickered like waterfalls across the screens. A steady hum of servers filled the silence. It was a place stripped of distractions, where your mind became the sharpest weapon in the room. There, I wasn't invisible. There, my words carried weight. Every keystroke could change the fate of a mission. Every signal mattered. For 3 days straight, I had been chasing a digital whisper in the South Pacific. Everyone else dismissed it as interference, a glitch. But I saw the rhythm, the faint pulse beneath the noise. My instincts screamed that it was deliberate. When my commanding officer, Major Jonathan Pierce, finally looked over my shoulder, he said nothing for 5 long minutes. Then he asked quietly, "Are you sure, Echo?" "It's a whisper," I replied without hesitation. "But it's screaming." His hand landed firmly on my shoulder. "Then let's scream back." He authorized Protocol Chimera on my call. My analysis had just triggered a billion-dollar military operation. And yet, back home in Houston, my father still thought I scrubbed floors. That Thanksgiving night, when the dishes were finally cleared and the relatives drifted home, I found my mother scrubbing a pot in the kitchen. I asked her softly why she never defended me, why she let to talk down to me in front of everyone. She sighed, never meeting my eyes. Caroline, your father only understands things he can see and touch. Like a new car on the lot. Ethan. Ethan needs his encouragement. You've always been independent. Strong. You don't need it the way he does. Her words weren't comfort. They were a cage. A reminder that in that house, I would always be the outsider. But I didn't fight it. Because I had already made a choice. I would never explain my world to them again. I would let it speak for itself when the time came. And that time was coming. People like my father believed power lived in the visible. Keys to a new Corvette, a fat promotion printed in bold headlines, applause at a wedding toast. He had no idea that real power often existed in silence. For 21 straight days, my life wasn't my own. I was buried in Protocol Chimera, an operation that consumed every second of my existence inside a sealed intelligence facility in Tampa, Florida. The sun was just a rumor there. Our windows were screens. Our days measured not by clocks but by encrypted data feeds. My world shrank to a wall of monitors, cascading code, shifting satellite images, blurred voices caught on the edge of translation. It was a symphony of noise, and my job was to hear the single wrong note before it became catastrophe. By the third week, I was running on caffeine and muscle memory. I'd slept in 40-minute bursts on a cot behind my terminal, waking each time with the sensation that I was already late for something. My uniform jacket hung on the back of my chair, wrinkled and worn from too many hours in the same room. Echo, a Major Pierce said one evening, his voice low but urgent. You've been leading this too long. You need to stand down. I can't, I told him, eyes fixed on the flickering signal thread I'd been following across 3 continents. If I blink, we miss it. He studied me for a long time, then finally sighed. You've earned the trust to make the call. But don't burn yourself out. We need you intact. Trust. That was the highest currency in my world. And it was the only thing that kept me alive. 3 nights later, I caught it, the ghost pulse I'd been chasing. Buried in a mess of South Pacific transmissions, a faint pattern emerged like a heartbeat under static. It wasn't a mistake. It was a weapon hidden in plain sight. I didn't breathe as I pulled cross-references from shipping manifests, weather data, and intercepted signals. The pattern screamed louder with every new connection. What had looked like random noise was in fact a map, a prelude to an attack designed to cripple U.S. naval forces. I reported it immediately. Within hours, the room exploded into controlled chaos, teams moving in coordinated silence, secure lines lighting up, plans set in motion. That's when Major Pierce's hand came down on my shoulder again. This is your find. You've carried Chimera from the start. But now, he hesitated, and his eyes softened. You've done enough. We'll finish the final stage. Get out of here. Go see your family. That's an order. I wanted to argue, but exhaustion had eaten away the edges of my willpower. For the first time in weeks, I let myself exhale. He wasn't dismissing me, he was granting me parole. Still, I knew better than to believe in freedom. My phone, secured with layers of encryption, stayed within reach even as I packed my duffel bag. My release from Chimera wasn't an end. It was a pause. And that pause led me straight into Ethan's wedding. The morning of the ceremony, I stood in a sterile hotel room staring at the bridesmaid dress draped across the chair. I'd been awake since before dawn, my nerves sharpened by the silence of civilian life. It felt wrong to be surrounded by pastel fabrics and curling irons when, only days before, I'd been parsing signals that could shift the balance of international power. Then my secure phone buzzed once. The message was stripped of all pleasantries, just a single line from Pierce's aide. Nightfall is a go. Assets cleared. Pentagon briefing at 1900 Eastern. Admiral to speak. I did the math instantly. 7 p.m. Eastern. Right in the middle of Ethan's reception. A cold calm settled over me. The timing wasn't just inconvenient, it was inevitable. The two halves of my life, the one my father ridiculed and the one the nation depended on, were about to collide in front of everyone who had ever underestimated me. I typed back one word: acknowledged. Then I slipped the phone into my bag and began getting ready for the wedding, moving like a spectator in a play. I pinned my hair, painted on a polite smile, and prepared to stand beside my brother as if nothing in the world was shifting beneath our feet. Every conversation I had that day, about the flowers, the cake, the band, felt absurd. Wallpaper talk before an earthquake. I nodded, smiled, answered questions, all while feeling the clock ticking down inside me. My family saw only what they wanted. The quiet daughter, the awkward sister, a bridesmaid fading into the background. They had no idea that a countdown had begun. And when that countdown hit 0, nothing would ever be the same. The wedding day blurred into rehearsed smiles and staged photographs. I stood beside my brother Ethan and his new wife, grinning for the camera while a clock ticked in the back of my mind. Every minute pulled me closer to 7 o'clock, closer to the inevitable collision between my secret world and the one my father flaunted like a crown. The reception was held in a chandelier-lit ballroom of the Hilton Dallas Lincoln Center, decorated with white roses and crystal vases. Guests mingled in cocktail dresses and tuxedos, sipping $100 champagne as though the evening was scripted for a movie. For my father, Richard Lawson, it was more than a wedding, it was a coronation. His son, the golden child, had married a beautiful woman from a wealthy family. Every guest was another member of the court, and he played the king to perfection. He raised his champagne glass, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who had never been questioned. To Ethan and Rachel. May your life together be filled with prosperity, joy, and success. The guests applauded, clinking glasses in unison. Richard thrived on the attention, feeding off the smiles and nods of admiration. He always did. Then, as if remembering an afterthought, his eyes swept the room until they landed on me. And of course, he said with a dismissive chuckle, "In my daughter, Caroline. Always so mysterious." He gave a theatrical wave of his hand. "She works for the government down in Florida, cleaning up after the Navy SEALs, I think." The crowd burst into laughter. It was the same joke he had told a dozen times before, the one that turned my career into a punchline. Guests laughed politely, some knowingly, others nervously. They didn't care if it was cruel, it was safe to laugh at me. I stood perfectly still, a half smile frozen on my lips, my hands clasped lightly in front of me. Years in uniform had trained me to remain unshaken. But inside, something shifted. The laughter didn't sting anymore. It didn't burn like it once had. It was colder now, like metal forged in ice. Every chuckle from the crowd was another confirmation of the decision I had made long ago. Never again would I explain my world to them. I would let it reveal itself. And when it did, they would have no choice but to understand. From across the room, I caught the sharp gaze of Colonel James Miller, the retired army officer who had known me since childhood. His expression wasn't laughter, it was pity. And that pity cut deeper than my father's dismissal. Because Miller knew. He'd seen enough in uniform to recognize what others could not. The quartet resumed its music, and the laughter faded into the clinking of glasses. My father, satisfied with his moment, pulled Rachel onto the dance floor, spinning her proudly as if he were the groom himself. The ballroom swelled with music, chatter, and celebration. But just as the noise reached its peak, the screens positioned around the ballroom flickered. At first, guests thought it was part of the slideshow, a collection of childhood photos of Ethan, cycling through his soccer trophies, his prom pictures, his graduation. But then the slideshow vanished, replaced by the stark banner of a special report. The quartet faltered. The music stopped. A ripple of confusion spread through the room. "Wait," as someone whispered. "Is that the news?" The anchor's face appeared, serious and somber. His voice cut through the ballroom like a blade. "We interrupt this broadcast with breaking news from the Pentagon. A potential international crisis has been averted. We now go live to the press briefing." The room fell into stunned silence. On the giant screens, the seal of the Department of Defense filled the frame, then gave way to a podium. Standing there was Admiral Thomas Merrick, one of the most respected leaders in the Navy. My father froze, his champagne glass halfway to his lips. He squinted at the screen, confused but curious. He had no idea that the world he ruled with bluster and arrogance was about to collide with mine. Admiral Merrick began to speak, his voice measured and heavy with authority. He outlined what he called Operation Nightfall, praising the Navy SEALs who had executed it flawlessly. My father's chest puffed with pride, as though his joke about me cleaning for the SEALs he had suddenly gained weight. But then Merrick's tone shifted. He spoke of the unseen heroes, analysts who operated in silence, who sifted through oceans of noise to find whispers of threats. He emphasized that the entire operation had hinged on one analyst's discovery, a single voice that refused to dismiss a signal as meaningless static. And then came the moment. "This mission was a success before it began," Merrick said, leaning into the microphone. "Because one analyst, call sign Echo, found the signal no one else could. That decision saved countless lives. That decision saved this nation from a catastrophic strike." The ballroom was silent. My heart hammered against my ribs. Then the screen shifted again, cutting to pre-recorded footage. And there I was. Me, projected 50 feet tall on both walls of the ballroom. My hair tied back, my eyes fixed on a glowing map, my expression carved in exhaustion and determination. I was pointing at streams of data, surrounded by commanders hanging on every word I spoke. The silence in the room broke with a gasp. Captain Miller rose to his feet, his voice trembling but firm. "My God! That's her! That's Echo!" A murmur rippled through the guests, whispers of disbelief growing louder. Then, cutting through it all, came the sharp voice of one of my younger cousins. "Wait! I saw her on the news last month." Glass shattered. My father's champagne flute slipped from his hand, exploding against the marble floor in a spray of glittering shards. I turned my head slowly, meeting his wide, pale eyes across the room. And for the first time in my life, he didn't laugh. The sound of glass shattering was louder than the band had been a moment before. 100 guests froze, staring at my father, at the shards of his champagne flute scattered across the polished marble floor. Richard Lawson stood rigid, his ruddy, triumphant face drained of all colour. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again, no sound emerging. For a man who always had a story, a punchline, or an insult ready, silence looked foreign on him, unnatural. The screens kept rolling. Admiral Merrick continued, his words a drumbeat in the cavernous ballroom. He described the nearly invisible threat, how it was buried under petabytes of noise, designed to look like a glitch, designed to slip past every analyst but one. He told them the operation, the satellites, the seals, all of it depended on the decision of a single person. And then he repeated my call sign. Echo. The name hung in the air. A ripple of realization moved across the room like a wave. Guests turned toward me, their faces wide-eyed, whispers darting like sparks. Some gasped. Some looked frightened. Others looked at me with awe, as though they were seeing me for the first time. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just held my ground, calm, steady, the way I had trained myself to be in briefing rooms where panic was never an option. Wait, as someone whispered. That's her? That's Caroline? I thought she worked in some office. The screen cut to another clip, this one captured during the final phase of Chimera. I was seated at a glowing console, flanked by officers who leaned in close, their pens frozen above notepads, their eyes locked on my analysis. I was briefing a commander twice my age, pointing with a laser at a digital map filled with flashing signals. The exhaustion was clear on my face, but so was the certainty. My father's eyes shifted from the screen back to me, then back again, like a man caught in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. His lips trembled, his fingers twitching at his sides. Caroline, he mouthed silently. But I gave him nothing. No smile. No tears. No nod of recognition. Just the calm stare of someone who had waited her entire life for this moment, not for vengeance, but for truth. The guests around me stepped back as though I had become radioactive. The same relatives who had dismissed me for years now looked at me like a stranger. Like someone dangerous. Or mixed with fear in their eyes. Rachel, my new sister-in-law, clutched Ethan's arm. He looked pale, his jaw slack, his world cracking in real time. Then, breaking the silence, came the voice of Colonel James Miller. He stood tall, his old army bearing returning as he gave me a firm nod, the kind soldiers exchange when words aren't enough. Echo, he said. His voice was reverent. It wasn't a name anymore. It was a title. The room shifted again, the atmosphere almost suffocating. My father stumbled a step forward, as though he wanted to bridge the distance between us. But there was no bridge anymore. Not after a lifetime of jokes, dismissals, and ridicule. His eyes searched mine desperately, pleading for something, for forgiveness, for denial, for anything that could make this humiliation fade. But I had no intention of rescuing him. For the first time in my life, I felt nothing toward him. No anger. No grief. Not even the ghost of pain. Just finality. The broadcast ended, the Pentagon seal fading to black, and for a moment the ballroom was plunged into a silence so deep it felt physical. The band didn't start again. The servers froze mid-step with their trays of hors d'oeuvres. The laughter, the chatter, the dancing, it was all gone. The wedding reception was over. But the reckoning had just begun. My father had always been a man of volume. He filled every room with his booming voice, his laughter, his endless stories about himself and Ethan. But now, in that silent ballroom, he seemed small. He took one shaky step toward me. His shoes scraped against the marble, the only sound in a room that moments before had been filled with music and celebration. "Caroline," his voice broke on my name. It was the first time in years he had spoken it without mockery. But I didn't answer. His face was a ruin. The proud, ruddy complexion drained into an ashen mask. His eyes darted wildly between me and the black screen, as though trying to reconcile the two visions, his quiet, forgettable daughter and the woman who had just been revealed to the nation as a key to its survival. I didn't know, he stammered, his words useless, falling into the heavy air. No one moved to comfort him. Not my mother, who stood pale and trembling at the edge of the dance floor, her hands clasped so tightly they shook. Not Ethan, who stared at me as if he were meeting me for the first time. Not Rachel, whose face had gone blank with shock. They had all built their lives on a story in which I was invisible. And now that story had collapsed. I let him take another step. His hands twitched at his sides, opening and closing as if he wanted to reach out. But the distance between us wasn't measured in feet. It was measured in years of ridicule and dismissal. He mouthed another word, please, but I didn't give him what he wanted. No smile, no tears, no gesture of forgiveness. Just the steady gaze of someone who had finally accepted the truth. It was too late. I turned my head slowly, breaking eye contact with him. And in that moment, I turned my back on more than just my father. My mother's face was etched in horrified confusion. She had always defended him, always urged me to let your father have his moment. Now, her mask cracked, and she looked like a woman who had just realized the price of her silence. Ethan stood frozen, his arm around his new wife, his mouth slightly open. He looked at me as though I were a stranger, as though the sister he had ignored his whole life had been replaced by someone he didn't recognize. I walked across the deserted dance floor, my steps measured, each one echoing in the cavernous silence. Guests parted to let me through, some with awe, others with fear, none daring to speak. I stopped in front of the only person whose opinion mattered in that moment. Colonel James Miller. He stood ramrod straight, the years of military discipline still etched in his posture. The pity I had once seen in his eyes was gone, replaced by something else, respect. Pure, unadulterated respect. He didn't offer a handshake or an embrace. He simply gave me a sharp nod, the kind exchanged between soldiers who understood each other without words. Echo, he said. And for the first time in my life, the name didn't feel like a code or a burden. It felt like a truth. I nodded once in return. That was all the acknowledgement I needed. Then I walked past him and out of the ballroom, leaving behind the wreckage of my family's ignorance. Behind me, the silence pressed in on the guests, suffocating the last remnants of celebration. Ahead of me, the corridor stretched wide and empty. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like myself. 1 year later, the plaque on my office door read, Echo, Division Lead Analyst. The letters were etched in brushed steel, small but permanent. It didn't feel like a promotion. It felt like a correction, as though the record of my life had finally been updated to match the truth I'd carried in silence for years. Every morning, I walked into the command center in Tampa, and it felt like home. The low hum of servers, the icy chill of the recycled air, the the glow of monitors lining the walls. It was a world most people couldn't imagine, but to me it was comfort. It was purpose. The respect I carried in that room wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It came in the way junior analysts straightened when I passed their stations, in the way senior officers listened when I briefed them, in the way my name carried weight in conversations far above my pay grade. I didn't have to demand authority. I simply spoke, and people listened. At the head of the mahogany conference table, I stood with a laser pointer in hand, briefing a group of visiting intelligence directors from Washington. Major Pierce sat quietly to my right, his stoic expression softer than it used to be. He didn't interrupt, didn't correct. He simply listened. The threat matrix shows overlapping signals in the Baltic corridor, I explained, shifting slides. If these patterns continue, we'll be looking at coordinated interference within weeks. My team is already cross-referencing satellite data to predict likely points of escalation. One of the directors leaned forward, scribbling notes. Another raised her hand to ask for clarification. Their faces were grim, but their eyes told me the truth. They had come to hear me. Not my superiors. Me. I wasn't the quiet analyst in the corner anymore. I was the one they had flown down from DC to meet. When the briefing ended, the directors filed out, murmuring to each other about timelines and response strategies. My own team gathered around my terminal, the tension dissolving into the camaraderie that only came from surviving together in the pressure cooker of high-stakes intelligence. Ben, one of my youngest analysts, cracked a dark joke about a heavily redacted report, and the group burst into laughter. It wasn't the cruel laughter of wedding guests dismissing me. It was shared humor, born from the weight of impossible tasks carried together. This was my family now. Not the Lawsons. Not the relatives who had spent their lives measuring worth in sales figures and status symbols. My family was the people who trusted me in the silence, who leaned on me when the world tilted, who knew the stakes of our work without needing explanations. Later that afternoon, I sat in my office, the city skyline faint beyond the reinforced glass. A C-17 cargo plane rumbled into the sky in the distance, its silhouette fading into the hazy sunset. My phone buzzed with a notification. An email. The sender, Richard Lawson. The subject line, Your brother's anniversary. I stared at it for a long moment before clicking it open. It was exactly what I expected, a fumbling attempt at half-apology mixed with self-preservation. Phrases like I never understood, and I'm so proud now spilled across the screen. As if his pride were a prize I had spent my life trying to win. I read the words without emotion. They were like a letter lost in the mail, arriving 20 years too late, their meaning already dissolved. The ledger I had kept in my mind since childhood, the one that recorded every slight, every dismissal, every cruel joke, was closed now. The accounts were balanced. I didn't need his apology to be whole. I didn't need his pride to feel complete. With one deliberate click, I dragged the message to the trash. Then I turned back to the classified document glowing on my monitor. My work was waiting. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was hiding. I wasn't the ghost. I was Echo. And my voice carried farther than my father's laughter ever had. Family used to mean obligation to me. It meant showing up for dinners where my name was only mentioned as the punchline of a joke. It meant pretending I didn't hear the whispers when I left the room, or the sighs when I didn't fit into their picture-perfect narrative. For years, I tried to mold myself into their definition of family, appearing at weddings, birthdays, and holidays, even when I knew what was waiting, The half smiles, the teasing remarks, the constant comparison to Ethan. I thought that if I endured it long enough, they would finally see me. They never did. It took walking out of that ballroom, leaving my father standing in the wreckage of his pride, to understand that family isn't just blood. It's trust. It's loyalty. It's who you can count on when the weight of the world rests on your shoulders. I found that family in places they could never imagine, in windowless rooms at 3 in the morning, surrounded by glowing monitors and exhausted analysts. I found it in the camaraderie of people who didn't need to see medals or titles to believe in me, because they knew the weight of my words could tip the scales of history. We didn't need to say we were proud of one another. We showed it in every decision, every mission, every shared silence when the stakes were too high for words. True belonging, I realized, isn't about being included at someone's table. It's about building a table where trust is the only currency that matters. That lesson came into sharp focus during one of my first months as division lead. A new recruit, a nervous kid barely out of training, froze during an overnight shift. He had flagged a signal but doubted himself, too afraid to escalate it. By the time I reviewed the feed, the window to act had nearly closed. Instead of tearing into him, I sat beside him at the console. "You saw it," EI said quietly. "That's what matters. You trusted your instincts. Next time, you raise it immediately, even if you're not sure. That's how lives are saved." His relief was palpable, and in that moment I saw a reflection of myself, the younger version who had once been dismissed, mocked, doubted at every turn. I promised myself my team would never feel the way I had at my father's table. Because leadership, real leadership, isn't about who talks the loudest. It's about who listens. Sometimes I think about that wedding night, not the silence in the ballroom, but the silence afterward. In the days and weeks that followed, I received no calls from Ethan, no attempts at reconciliation from my mother. Just that one hollow email from my father. At first, it surprised me. Then I realized it made perfect sense. Their story couldn't include me anymore. To admit who I was meant admitting they had been wrong about me all along. And Richard Lawson was a man who never admitted he was wrong. But strangely, I don't feel bitterness about that. Instead, I feel something closer to freedom. When you stop trying to earn validation from people who will never give it, the world opens up. You find strength in places you didn't know existed. You create your own definitions of worth, your own metrics of success. For my father, success was measured in sales figures, applause, and champagne toasts. For me, it's measured in lives saved, in missions that end without headlines because disaster was averted before it began. He wanted trophies on shelves. I wanted silence on the news ticker. And I got exactly what I wanted. That's what true success feels like. Not loud, not flashy, but steady. A quiet current that shapes the world without needing to announce itself. Sometimes, late at night, when the command center is quiet and the hum of servers is the only sound, I look around at my team and feel something I never felt growing up in the Lawson household. Belonging. Because these people aren't impressed by car dealerships or flashy promotions. They don't care about appearances at weddings or the jokes told over champagne. They care about whether you show up, whether you carry your weight, whether you can be trusted when it matters. And that, I've learned, is what family really means. The last time I saw my father was across that ballroom floor, his champagne flute shattered at his feet, his kingdom of laughter collapsing around him. I've never gone back. In the months since, I've received scattered attempts, emails from my mother, polite but strained, holiday cards from Ethan and Rachel, signed without personal notes, and, once, a letter from my father that arrived in a plain white envelope. I never opened it. It sits at the bottom of a desk drawer, sealed, irrelevant. For years, I carried an internal ledger of every slight, every insult, every joke at my expense. It was my way of keeping score, of reminding myself that my silence wasn't weakness, it was endurance. But the night of the wedding, when my call sign was spoken aloud for the nation to hear, that ledger closed. Permanently. There's no debt left to collect. No apology that would matter. Because I don't need their recognition anymore. One evening, about a year after nightfall, I sat in my office long after the rest of my team had gone home. The glow of my monitor lit the room, casting long shadows across the walls. Outside, the city was a blur of lights, cars threading through highways like veins of fire. A new recruit had left a sticky note on my desk before leaving for the night. Just 3 words, written in hurried handwriting. Echo saves lives. It made me pause. Not because I doubted it, but because I realized how far I had come from being a spooky, the family ghost, the butt of every dinner table joke. I thought about my father again, not with anger, not even with sadness. Just clarity. Richard Lawson believed power was loud. That it was something you proved with trophies, cars, applause. He never understood that the most important work is invisible, that strength is measured not in what people see, but in what they will never know you prevented. He wanted me small because it made him feel big. But the truth was always larger than his ego could contain. And when Admiral Merrick spoke my call sign on national television, the truth crushed him. That was the end of his story. Mine is still being written. Some nights, I think about what might happen years from now. Maybe Ethan will tell his children about me, not as the awkward aunt in the corner, but as Echo, the woman who sat behind glowing screens and heard the whispers no one else could. Maybe my mother will one day admit to herself that silence isn't peacekeeping, it's complicity. But whether they ever change doesn't matter anymore. Because I am not the Lawson family's ghost. I am not a joke told over champagne. I am Echo. And my voice, even whispered, will always be louder than their laughter.